With only 2 weeks to go until Rise of the Floodborn releases, I thought this would be the perfect time to look at some of the revealed cards, and mainly the revealed archetypes. In this video we're going to be looking at bounce, and I'm going to go over some of the new bounce cards, and how I think they have potential in the upcoming meta. I have two different decks to show today. I have a Rockstar bounce list, which I think will be one of the more competitive decks in the format, and I also have a bounce burn list, which uses a lot of the new cards from set 2. So stay tuned for the end for those. Now the first set of cards I want to look at are the Madam Mim cards. We have a Fox, Snake and Purple Dragon, but for this segment I'm just going to talk about the Fox and the Snake. So both of these cards read, when you play this character, you have to banish her or return another chosen character of yours to your hand. Now this sounds like a downside, but once we look at some of the other cards in the deck, then it will start to make a lot more sense. We can do some cool things with stuff from set 1 already, like with example for Lilo, we can quest with it, and then we can bounce it back to our hand and then play it again to either protect it, or we can draw another card with Rockstar Stitch. So there are a lot of cool creative plays you can make with this deck, and just off of these two cards alone, and it's important to note that the Fox also has Rush. So now let's move on to the Purple Dragon. This card reads the same as the other cards, except from you have to return 2 chosen characters rather than just the 1. But in return, you get a huge 7 cost, 5 attack, 7 defense, quests for 4 evasive unit, which in the late game is going to close out a lot of games for you, especially where you're gaining lore in a lot of unorthodox ways. Just having a big evasive unit that's hard to remove can just really win you the game. Now it might sound like a huge downside having to return 2 of your chosen characters, but if you stick with me, then I'll show you the cards that you're going to want to bounce back, which are going to give you just positives rather than negatives. So you're going to be playing this huge card, and then you're also going to be gaining a lot more positives from the cards you're bouncing back. And overall it's just a really solid card, and even if you don't have uses for it, which you won't in every game, you could just ink it. Just being inkable is just such a great thing for this card, I reckon. And it's definitely a card that your opponent's going to have to be wary of from very early on in the game, or otherwise they're just going to get blown out by it. So there's been a lot of talk of cards we want to add back to our hands, but what actually are they? These are the Merlin cards. We have 5 of them in the new set, but I'm only going to be talking about 3 in this video because I think they're the only 3 that you're really going to want to play in the decks coming up to set 2. So we'll start off with the Merlin Goat. Now this card is an inkable 4 cost, 4 free that quests for 1, which reads, when you play this character or when he leaves play, you gain 1 lore. Now this is the first time I think we've seen the ability to add lore without questing, so you can kind of have this like almost burn effect if you're familiar with other TCGs, where you can just gain lore that the opponent cannot react to. And it's also important to note that when it says this card leaves play, that includes being added back to your hand, or if it's banished in a challenge. This also includes if it's removed by cards like Let It Go, which adds it to the inkwell. So basically any way it literally leaves play, the effect will activate, and that's the same for all of the cards that I'm about to talk about. So moving on to my favourite Merlin card, this is the Rabbit card. It's a 4 cost uninkable 2 free, which on paper looks pretty bad, but the ability is when you play this card and when he leaves play, you may draw a card. Now this, combined with cards like Maleficent and Friends on the Other Side, which Amethyst already has access to, you're just going to have so much card draw, and it's going to make the deck really consistent. My favourite thing about all of these cards is just the amount of decision making you have to make. Because they both cost 4, you have to choose between either accelerating your lore count and getting to 20 quicker, or drawing more cards to just give yourself more options in the mid to late game. Okay, so next up we have Shapeshifter Merlin. This is one of the stronger cards in the deck, if you can get it going. This card reads, whenever one of your other characters is returned to your hand from play, this character gets +1 lore this turn. So you can set up some really cool turns where you're drawing a lot of cards, gaining a lot of random lore, and then you can quest with this for 5 lore, or just numbers like that can get quite crazy. My main issue with this card is that it doesn't do anything immediately, so like the other cards where they're immediately drawing cards and immediately gaining lore, this card kind of has to sit on the board for a whole turn, which puts a massive target on its head. But if you can trade this card for a Dragonfire or a Let It Go, then you're trading +1 ink, so it might not be too bad in practice. Regardless of the huge target this card has on its head, you can still set up for some crazy turns where you can just blow out the opponent from nowhere, and they have to recalculate how much lore you can gain to know if you have lethal or not, and it just creates this really huge surprise factor in the game that we've not seen yet in set 1. There's just one more card I want to talk about for the bounce archetype, and that's Arthur, Wizard's Apprentice. This is a 3 cost uninkable 1 free stat line, which quests for 1, which reads, whenever this character quests, you may return another chosen character of yours to your hand to gain +2 lore. Now this has some really cool effects. So obviously you can bounce the Merlin cards back to your hand to just draw and gain random lore, but if you bounce back the Go card, then this card on its own is questing for 4. It also has the effect of protecting cards like Lilo, so you're essentially questing with Lilo and this card for a combined total of 5, which for those cards in the early game, especially from turn 3, is really impactful. Moving on to the deck lists now, and the first one I want to take a look at is this Rockstar bounce list which I've made. It has a lot of stronger cards that we've already seen from set 1, mainly Rapunzel, Lantern, Rockstar Stitch, Lilo and Simba. So you still have the really strong early game of Lilo and Simba with the shift Rockstar Stitch. You've also got the power ramp of the Lanterns and the card draw of the Rapunzel, but then we just fill it out with this really huge bounce package. So we're still seeing all the cards that we've spoken about, but you have the opportunities to make some really tricky plays for the opponent. So you can still have the draw engine of Rockstar Stitch, even though you're not going very heavy on the 1 and 2 drops, but you can bounce them back to just generate all these extra 1 drops. We also see Befuddle, which is a set 1 card, which can also bounce back Lilo and Simba to help you draw a card with Rockstar Stitch. But you just have so many different tricky lines of plays with all the bounces that your opponent's not really going to know how to react to it. And as opposed to traditional Rockstar lists, which we're seeing in set 1, they don't really have a big closer card, which the Purple Dragon definitely fills that spot really nicely. Because you're playing Rockstar Stitch, you're drawing a lot of cards anyway, not to even mention the fact that you still have the Maleficent and the Friends, as well as the Merlin Rabbit to draw you cards. You're more than likely going to have enough resources to have 2 extra characters on the board to bounce back with the Purple Dragon, which just gives you this free, huge unit. And that's assuming that we're bouncing back cards that don't have an effect when added back to your hand. So when you play the Purple Dragon and you bounce back the rabbit and a goat, for example, you're gaining a lore and drawing a card, and then probably questing for just another 4 with the Purple Dragon, as well as anything else on the board, which just means in the later stages of the game, you can just have these insane turns where you just quest for 10, which means your early game doesn't necessarily have to be the best. You just have to come up with these really tricky, creative lines of play for the mid game and the late game. Moving on to the second deck, I think this deck will be a lot of fun to play, but I don't necessarily think it will be the most meta viable, especially not right now with the cards that we have revealed. There's a couple of cards here which I've not spoke about, so I'll quickly give you a quick rundown of those. So we see 4 Flynn Riders, which is just a vanilla 1/3, and then we see 2 of the new 2-cost Pinocchios. This is a 1/1 quest for free, which is really good to bounce, especially with Arthur. We see 4 Donald Ducks, which basically just lets you draw an extra card per turn. We see 2 Rays, which is just an evasive 3/3 quest for free, which costs 5, which is very good, especially in the later games where you're just nearing the 20 lore. It just creates that extra bit of threat, especially alongside the Purple Dragon. You're just going to have 2 huge evasive units, which the opponent may or may not be able to deal with. And then we see one of the cards that makes this whole deck what it is. It's Pack Tactics, which basically, for every damaged character your opponent has, you gain 1 lore, which is very instant. And if the opponent's going very wide and they're not expecting this card, you can just gain like around 4 lore on average just through this 1 card, which in the later stages of the game, the opponent isn't going to be playing around and you're just going to win the game that way. And then we also see Sorcerer's Spellbook, which is going to gradually get you towards that 20 threshold that I keep talking about. For the price of 1 ink a turn, you gain 1 lore, which doesn't sound too good, but the way that you're slowly getting closer and closer, and there's not really an efficient way to get rid of lore at the moment, the opponent's on a very slim timer, especially because you're gaining lore for a lot of cards which instantly give you the lore, hence why I call this more of a burn archetype. Just like with the Rockstar list, you're going to be wanting to look for these tricky mid and late game lines with the bounce cards, which makes it really difficult for your opponent to play around. But unlike the Rockstar list, instead of going for more character-based ways to win, we're going for more of like a spell-based way to win, which I think is really interesting, and it's the first time that we've really seen this style of play. Overall, I'm really looking forward to the way that this game's going to evolve, and maybe this deck might become a bit stronger with sets to come if they introduce more ways to gain lore without having to quest. So that's it for the deck breakdown. If you want to see some games with these decks, keep an eye out on the channel in the next coming days, because I'll be posting a couple of gameplay videos showcasing both of these decks in action. What do you think of Bounce? Do you reckon it'll be meta defining, or do you think it's just a tricky gimmick? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video.